Hi, I am Kori Schake, the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and this is the first installment of our new podcast, Sounds Strategic. And what we are doing in this conversation is to showcase the wealth of analytic and intellectual talent at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The podcast is going to have the same kind of pattern each time, a similar set of questions that each of our folks answer, and it is our hope that by being part of a conversation with them, that you will take an interest in reading their work and seeking them out as sources if you are journalists or people organizing coursework. Won't you please use this as a tasting menu of the extraordinary talent of this institution? And today, our first guest on this podcast is the outstanding leader of our defense and military analysis team, Dr. Bastian Giegerich. Bastian has been a Fulbright Fellow in the U.S. He holds a degree from the University of Potsdam, a PhD from the London School of Economics, and he runs our largest research team here. Bastian, welcome.
Kori, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here for the first edition of this, to be present at the creation, and I'm looking forward to it.
I thought we would start, as you had suggested we do, by talking about NATO's big Trident Juncture exercise. Since you are yourself a European security expert, I forgot to mention you worked in the German Defense Ministry from 2010 to 2015 and have written a number of supremely good books on European security.
Thank you.
So tell us, how should we understand what's going on in this NATO exercise?
I think it's an interesting case, actually. Trident Juncture obviously started at the end of October, ran through to November 7. It got a lot of traction in the media for being the largest exercise that NATO has run in the last 2 decades or so. Takes place in central and eastern Norway. It took place in central and eastern Norway, North Atlantic, Baltic Sea. So interesting geography. But I think what really is at core here are the three messages that I think NATO is after with this exercise. And the first one is really has little to do with the overall size, and it's really about the mindset that it represents when an alliance like NATO goes on an exercise like Trident Juncture, and it's about being ready. It's about preparing yourself for dealing with adversaries, and it's about the message that you're ready at all times. And I think that is maybe something that wasn't at the forefront of how NATO and NATO nations thought about the alliance. And I think the second signal is perhaps, or the second purpose is perhaps a bit more prosaic, but it is about making sure that the muscle memory is there, that NATO can move large formations, that it can do so at speed, that it can reinforce forward deployed elements. And it's really about recreating a sense of almost just a routine in doing those kinds of things that NATO has not done for a little while. And then I think there's a signal in there as well, internally and externally, about, for NATO member states, the solidarity that Trident Juncture represents, the unity that it is meant to portray, and of course to those on the outside who might have designs on NATO allies. It is clearly a message of deterrence that NATO is in the process of rebuilding its deterrence, which some might have felt has become a bit brittle over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I noticed that the Russian foreign minister suggested that if NATO returns to a posture of deterrence, Russia would take this as aggressive. And they also suggested that this exercise was a dangerous and destabilizing one. How do you react to that?
Yeah, with a healthy dose of laughter, I think, because really, yes, you could of course say an exercise means NATO is preparing for war. I think what it means is NATO is preparing to defend itself. I mean, that's what it's for. That's what its member states, what its governments, its electorates expect. And that's the whole point. So the Russian reaction is, of course, interesting. It, of course, comes in a context of Russian military activity that has grown over the last couple of years, and I think it is clearly, to me, it's a signal that the message is actually getting through more than anything else.
Excellent. And what did you and your team of sharpshooters learn watching the NATO exercise? What do allies need to work on? What were you surprised by? Anything we were still capable of that we hadn't exercised in a while? Turn your analytic eye to the exercise.
I mean, for us as the defense team here at the IISS, I mean, we look at these exercises really as one of the measures when we think about military capability, what people are capable of, and how we go about assessing that in an open source environment, which is what we do. And so exercises feature in that bracket of our work. And I think, you know, part of it is, in this case, is about military mobility. It is about reinforcing over distance, but it is also really about exercising a collective defense response in a challenging geography and under challenging conditions. And I think that's really what this exercise represents. And that's why we're watching it closely, and it, of course, that's how we integrate it into our data sets.
Fabulous. So for people who are not quite as nerdy as you and I are, give them some of the basics of who was involved, what level of magnitude, how does this compare, for example, to the big exercises that the Russians, Chinese, and other Shanghai Cooperation Organization participants did in the Vostok exercise?
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about here with Trident Juncture is some 50,000 personnel, 10,000 vehicles, 250 aircraft, about 65 naval vessels, including a U.S. aircraft carrier. So it's a sizable, by NATO standards, it's a very sizable exercise. Still smaller than some of the exercises that Russia has been involved in, but I think as a signal of intent, it is very clear, and certainly of a size that is notable. I think it's interesting that all NATO member states are involved. That partners Sweden and Finland, who are not NATO members, but are obviously in that geography and have an interest in being closely associated with NATO, are involved. I think that is an encouraging sign. I think it also tells you a lot about actually the defense policies of those two countries, Sweden and Finland, who will look at NATO as an organization that maybe the majority of the population at this point does not want them to join, but certainly an organization that they want to be closely aligned with. And of course, NATO itself thinks about Sweden and Finland as potential contributors, actually, in a defense case, and certainly in terms of using airspace, possibly using some bases to help NATO reinforce.
Yeah, my rebuttal to the Russian concern about the NATO exercises would be, if you guys weren't threatening NATO allies, we wouldn't have had the consensus in the alliance to do big exercises again. It's a reaction to Russia's bad behavior.
I think so, and I think it is in part it is, you know, it's a process that started a little over 4 years ago. The Wales summit in 2014, where NATO began to get its head around a changing security environment in which a conventional or simply just a military aggression, military confrontation in Europe became a very real possibility again. And I think the exercise fits into that adaptation process. And I think the interesting thing about NATO in that context, to me, is there's a slight disconnect here. Actually, NATO has done a lot of work since then, driving transformation forward from Wales to Warsaw to the Brussels summit that we had earlier this year, and yet it finds itself in a position where internally it feels weak and conflicted, and part of it is obviously reactions to the current U.S. administration, but part of it is also just a sense of the magnitude of the work that is ahead, in particular for some European allies who really need to rebuild forces that have hollowed out or have been hollowed out over the past 2 decades or so, and they're now realizing that is a daunting task that will certainly keep them busy for years to come.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, and Germany figures prominently among those countries that need to rebuild their military. I heard a terrible joke about the German defense minister having more children than more operational submarines. Give us a quick snapshot of where Germany stands on this.
Yeah, I think than any submarines. I think if I'm not getting my numbers confused at the moment. But I think where Germany stands is really an important measure, perhaps, of where Europe overall is, because Germany is one of those countries that in Europe would actually move the needle if it decided to be very serious about defense. It's one of those countries that would have the size and the economic potential to actually make a significant difference here. And I think when you look at the thinking in Germany, in the military establishment, in the leadership, civilian leadership, it is pretty clear that there is a return to collective defense, that there's a return to fully equipping the force so that it has the right equipment at 100% at all times for all contingencies, all things that had gone out the window when Germany was trying to adapt to international crisis management operations, where one thought, well, maybe you can actually have something like just-in-time delivery for military maintenance and repair. Turns out that that's not quite as easy as people thought. And I think there's perhaps a counterintuitive moment here where I think in terms of Germany's strategic culture, the way the country and its elites think about the armed forces, I think that collective defense mind frame is actually a more comfortable mind frame to be in, even though ultimately it would mean high-intensity warfare, which obviously no one desires and no one wants. But it is a more acceptable posture, perhaps, than international force projection for crisis management purposes.
Sure. I mean, defending your own population and your own territory sits more in the center of all of our reflexes, I think. Let me ask you a tradecraft question, which is, let me first say that one of the things that I think has been so detrimental about the American focus in the last decade and at highest volume and nastiness in the Trump administration is this burden sharing question. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that we have not succeeded particularly well in getting Europeans to spend more on defense. Russia's bad behavior did that. You see the start of European defense spending change after Russia's seizure of Crimea and interference, aggression in Ukraine. But what we did succeed in doing is persuading Europeans that they don't have the ability to do anything with their military forces, namely this sort of sense of progressive anemia. And for me, the example always is that Germany, France, and Britain were all participants in the Iranian nuclear agreement, and any one of those three countries could win a war against Iran. If push came to shove, none of those three countries believe that about themselves, and they're not creating policies from that mindset of strength. That's what it looks to me we have succeeded. Yeah. Do you have a view on that?
I think this is really interesting because it goes to the fact that I think that there's a major misconception in that area, and I think actually our field, strategic studies, war studies, or everybody who works, or the scholars, policy analysts working in this area, I think that's one of the misconceptions that Europeans cannot achieve a degree of strategic autonomy. I think that's either lazy or wrong. I mean, depending on what people actually feel about it. But I think, to me, what would that mean? It would mean decision making. It would mean capabilities, and it would mean the defense industrial capacity to support that. And I think, for whatever reasons, we as Europeans, perhaps with American help, have talked ourselves into a position where we don't think this is possible. Yes, it would take a lot of money. Yes, it would take a lot of time. But I think clearly, collectively, there is enough potential, there is enough political will to actually try and achieve this. And I think if one negates that or talks as if or conceives of this problem as somehow structural factors being in the way, I think, in the best case, perhaps it's a misguided attempt to protect the transatlantic relationship, when actually I think it will be much better protected by a stronger European contribution, frankly.
I agree with that.
Or it is really an attempt to avoid some of the difficult choices, because you would have European governments who would need to talk about their spending priorities. They would need to talk about where defense sits. Is it a discretionary activity, or is it something that you just need to get right? And I think that is perhaps where we're falling short, and the result is this idea that is very strong, that Europe cannot help itself but be dependent on others for its security. I think that there's a lot we could do if we actually wanted to.
I absolutely agree with that. It seems to me, I hope we never test this proposition,
Yes.
but I think if Russia were to attack Europe, that the European countries would, even without American assistance, could win that war. I hope we never test it, because I hope the Russians never attack a NATO ally. I also hope the United States' commitment always remains strong and vibrant to the collective defense of the allies. But it seems to me unquestionable that the Europeans could actually win that war. Before we close, though, I want to run through a list of a couple of questions with you.
Sure.
Starting with, how did you get interested in this work? How do you become a big shot defense analyst?
Well, I think, Kori, you have. I'll lay some of the blame on your doorstep, actually. And you mentioned the Fulbright Fellowship, and that to me was actually an important moment for my own professional interest and development, because it really helped broaden my horizon, get interested into defense questions, transatlantic security questions. It's always a confluence of things that coincided in my case with Balkan crisis, NATO around its 50th anniversary getting involved in the air campaign, and being German, it was a time where there was a fairly intense debate in many European countries, but perhaps particularly in Germany, about when is it right and justified to use force? How do you think about using force together with allies and partners? And it was just a very intense moment, perhaps, where some of these conversations came to the fore, linked to actually at the time a Franco-British proposal to give the EU an autonomous military crisis management dimension, and so these things together, the security situation in Europe, some ideas about where European cooperation might help, and then the opportunity to take these unformed ideas and spend some time in the U.S. Thinking about them with the help of some very smart and very experienced people, certainly put me on this trajectory, and I think that's about 20 years ago or so. That was probably the moment when I got interested in this field.
Fabulous. Best book in the field for you.
Can I say The Military Balance? Probably not.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Then in that case, obviously The Military Balance, which is a wonderful book. When I was a PhD student...
Which, dear readers, he produces.
It's wonderful. You should get it. When I was a PhD student, I was waiting every year for the new edition to come out. But some other books, if I were a student now in this field, in international relations, interested in these kinds of problems, I think I would really like a book called Force and Statecraft by Paul Gordon-Loren, Gordon Craig, and Alexander George. I think it's a really good book to explore the intersection between politics and the use of armed force, between diplomacy and violence, so to speak. I think it's a really nice framework to think through these issues if we want to talk about issues of coercive diplomacy, deterrence. I think it's a book that really gives readers, a very nice framework to think through these issues, and then you can go and apply it to Iran's nuclear program, Taiwan question, Russia and NATO. It's really a very nice Very nice book, a good textbook that I would recommend. And if I'm allowed one more,
you are.
because I recently read a book that I really thought I really enjoyed quite a bit, and it's Christopher Coker's Rebooting Clausewitz, and I'm mentioning this book because it has a really quirky take on a really unwieldy subject, which is Clausewitz's writing. And
okay, so I'm going to go read it because I actually. Reading Clausewitz for me is such drudgery.
It's not fun.
Like, it's so important to master, but wow, I feel like I should be getting paid when I'm reading it.
Yes.
So fresher takes on what should all of us know without me having to go once again into Clausewitz would be fabulous.
I think it's really good for that purpose, and I think Clausewitz in the original is certainly not fun. It's very confusing. And what I like about Chris Coker's book is that he takes a fictional Clausewitz and drops him into real-world modern context, like a think tank conversation, a West Point seminar, and has that character enter into dialogue with these practitioners and scholars of war. And that's a nice way, actually, slightly quirky perhaps, but a nice way to bring these old ideas to life, and it's certainly a much better read than the original.
Sounds great. Top of my reading list. Okay. What is the conventional wisdom in our field that you think is wrong?
Well, I think I'd like for a moment to go back to that strategic autonomy thing, because that really bothers me, and I think that's something that is so ingrained in our field, and I think there are currently at least three different schools of thought on this. For one, European strategic autonomy is about being a counterweight to the U.S. Interestingly, I think that might be where the current German government, or at least the foreign ministry, is landing. For the UK, it is probably about providing a useful contribution as a strong partner to the U.S. And for France, I think it is literally about independent action. And I think it really strikes me that there is, if you say this is achievable, the reaction is usually, well, it's either naive or unwise. And it seems to me that is really a case where we should just all think a little bit harder along the lines that we discussed a few minutes ago, and accept that it's a big task, it's a big challenge. Maybe there could be an IISS project about it at some point.
Excellent idea.
And I think we could help to correct that conventional wisdom that does suggest something like strategic autonomy is not possible for Europe. I think it's worth thinking about under which conditions it could be, what the cost might be, and whether we're willing to consider them. I'm not saying it's necessarily a great idea, but I think saying it can't be done strikes me as slightly short-sighted.
I share that judgment that's the conventional wisdom that's wrong. Okay, favorite piece of your own work that you've ever done? What's the one you like best? It doesn't need to be the best, just the one you like the best.
For my own sake, I hope it's still to come. But I think something, and where I want to give a lot of credit to the defense team here at the Institute. Something that I'm quite proud of is what we've done around the Military Balance Plus, that new database that we've built. It's been a long-standing ambition for the Institute to bring together its defense data and analysis in an electronic resource that can be searched, that can be updated, that can give all these tools to people, and we've finally managed to do that. We've launched it now.
As somebody who spent hours and hours and hours flipping through pages of the book.
Yes.
Wow. Do I look forward to that?
I probably would have shaved half a year of my PhD if this had existed back then. But I think if you're looking for to help you build an evidentiary base for your policy work, for your market analysis, for your academic paper, or if you just like to count tanks and rockets, it's a great place to start. So I encourage you all to look at that. But a non-IISS piece that I quite like, that I was involved in, and it probably makes sense in the string of things that I've been talking about today, is a study that I did with a couple of colleagues a few years ago, Heiko Biel and Alexander Jonas, that looked at strategic cultures in Europe. And we thought it was an interesting problem to try and understand why European countries look at the use of force, look at different multinational frameworks to apply force, look at how they organize civilian control of that instrument, and understand the similarities but also the differences, because we felt if we understand that, we can actually come up with ideas for how we can get better at collaborating, better at generating capability together. And then the problem we of course had as well, there are so many countries, how do we deal with this? And we were able to bring together a group of some 28 or 29 writers who all tackled different case studies of all EU member states, plus Turkey, and we even managed to make them stick to, more or less at least, to an analytical framework that we had designed. So I'm quite proud of that, because to my knowledge, at least at the time, it hadn't been done because it seemed too unwieldy. And luckily, at that point, the German Ministry of Defense decided that it would be good to actually invest in this. So that was a really fun thing to do.
Okay, and I have actually not read it, so thank you for giving me something else to put on my reading list.
My pleasure.
Closing question. Favorite data visualization?
Yeah.
And for listeners, we are going to post the graphic alongside the audio of this so that you can see what he's talking about.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. If we were to fast forward to February 2019, I think my favorite visualization then will be the new wall chart that we will publish with the Military Balance 2019, which will deal with China. I won't provide any spoilers here, but I think the team has done a tremendous job, and I think everybody interested in China's military modernization will want to have it. Now, at this point, I like visualizations that are relatively simple but have a big message, so to speak. And what we have done recently is we've mapped the exports of armed unmanned aerial systems around the world and put that into one image that just shows these different dynamics. And I think from that one image, you get a lot of different messages. You see how China's export activities are expanding. You see that these systems are now showing up in theaters and in places and in the hands of people who previously did not have access to this technology. You see, on the other hand, how the US has had a very restrictive policy when it comes to these exports, perhaps creating some unintended effects here in terms of competition. And I think it's a story that also suggests something about the shrinking technological advantage that the West enjoys. And I think that's a really important point because it ties back to how we, the West, if I may use that term, the members of the Euro-Atlantic community, how we have become accustomed to using armed force over the last 2 or 3 decades. And when these assumptions change, we really have to fundamentally rethink how we use this instrument of statecraft. And I think there's one image that shows that we've put together that shows all of this in one go, so to speak. And I think that's a really powerful visualization because it's one image that really at least makes me think and touches on a lot of different points, which is why I like it so much.
Yeah. It works at all sorts of levels.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of arrows coming out from China, of countries they are proliferating their UAVs to, the fact that the U.S. as a producer is only providing them to NATO allies. It looks like that South Africa is getting in the development deal, and the Russians as well. It's a fabulous graphic. Folks, go to the site to see it. Bastian Giegerich, thank you for this education, and thank you for the good work you do for the IISS.
Thank you very much, Kori. It's a pleasure.